It is episode 438 of This Is Whole Life. Melanie Bachman, Ken Whitmore, Lucas. Everybody is back this week, and just in time. Because I have a feeling that really it should be the Ken and Melanie show today. Just because we're looking for smart people that know things. And when it comes to Daniel, I feel like his brother Revelation, they're an odd duo.
I brought my popcorn.
Did you? That require a lot of study and maybe I don't know. It's hard to understand sometimes, and so I'm hoping, and I guess didn't get a chance to ask beforehand, but is there a common thread, or is Daniel just the common thread, and then we're going to look at all kinds of different things, or is there a theme that's going to run through? We started with Dominion this week through this series, but
so Dominion is the common thread that'll run through this series.
Wow.
There you go.
So we started off with the common thread. Well, and I think you did kind of mention that, didn't you? Now that just rings a bell.
For those who are listening to the sermon, that may have been mentioned.
See, now this might be the problem of why some of us get confused about Daniel. I've listened to the message 3 times, and I still, as soon as I asked it, then you said it.
And we're still in chapter 1. This is going to be a long series.
So this is a 6-month series, if I'm not wrong.
For some of us.
For some of us, it might be.
It'll be a 6-week series, but you said 6 month, but
so 6 months.
We'll probably take a break at Christmas.
If we start doing 6-month series, that's it would cut down on a lot of work in the communication department. Is all I'm saying. There'd be a lot less turnover of work to be done. I think that we may have to stop and think about that one. So there's question number 1. Just got blown to bits. That's good. So it's going to be a good series when you start off by quoting.
So stop. It's going to be a good series when, and he just got done being like, this is going to be going on forever.
That's why it's going to be a good.
Okay.
No. It's going to be a good series though, and this is why I'm trying to invite the rest of those that feel like me. I'm trying to invite you in, and just say it's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. I'm just saying, get in that chat on Saturday, 407-965-1607. Ask your questions early and often. Podcast at wholelife.church. Make sure that we don't leave you behind. Stay with us and ask your questions. But when you start with the great American philosopher Mike Tyson,
yes,
you just know that things have to be going the right direction. And so I had heard his.
For those who thought that Daniel was going to be intimidating, I just wanted to start off with a quote that would help everybody know that the most intimidating fighter of all time has some thoughts on the book of Daniel. Well, I mean, not specifically.
Yeah, that actually could have been taken a couple different ways. You're about to be punched in the face, or let's talk about being punched in the face.
However you want to read into that.
or whatever you say next may cause you to get punched in the face. I really wasn't sure where to go with that part of it, but
I felt punched.
Did you? Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Now,
and then, like a rat, they either freeze or the rest of that quote's pretty.
If you're good and your plan is working, somewhere during the duration of that, the outcome of that event you're involved in, you're gonna get to the wrath, the bad end of the stick. Oh man,
yeah.
What a great quote overall.
And so many metaphors tucked into that one quote.
Yeah.
But I don't think anybody hears that and in some way, shape, or form when it's like, oh yeah. Yeah, we've all stopped in fear and froze. Sometimes your plan is good; it's working. Gabby was in the chat like, "Yeah, my plan's never working." Is this going to set us up for more great American philosophers like every week? Are we going to be working off of like next week? It's like Muhammad Ali, move like a butterfly, sting like a bee, float like a butterfly.
I mean, I feel like you just have to tune in and find out.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to give away too much.
Or I thought maybe this would just be boxing. Like maybe there was going to be a boxing component.
And most people didn't know that the book of Daniel has a serious boxing connection there. So.
Well, and I think part of why we get a little confused or it gets hard to put things together, you started throwing out words like was it Shaltan? Shaltan.
Yeah.
And Dominion, but that was a different word. Did I not put that one down? How did I not? Boy, I tell you, this was...
So Shaltan and Dominion really are the same word, but Yeah.
People were finding that out. They were doing a little work. I was pretty impressed that even during the midst of it, there were people like asking questions, and I was like, "There's my people." Okay, I don't know what any of this means either. This is good. This is good. And Dale was super excited. Gabby and Dale were our hosts this week. And he's like, I've been waiting for this for a long time. He's like, Ken told me we were doing Daniel. I'm here for all of it. And I know that he likes to dig deep and study. And so I think that there's an excitement that everyone has for this. But the dominion or supreme power, it's different when you know it, but it's different when the pastor gets up front and says, now, normally I know what my job is. I'm supposed to get up here and tell you what the answers are. But I'm not going to do that. And immediately, it doesn't matter how much someone even might know it's coming. It's like things get eerily quiet. It's like, well, wait a minute. Well, who's going to answer the question? Like, wait a minute, are we answering the question?
Yeah.
And then Ken sent off to the music team, who did a great job this week, and it was like, think about it, and come up with an answer. So then he come back for the response time, and he still was just like, no, let's let him hang out there for a little bit. Let's wait. Gabby I thought did a great job, and then finally it was like, okay, I'll give you a little bit about what I think about this. So did anyone else actually write down what you thought about the difference between Daniel, the Dan 4, the big Dan 4, I don't know, versus Hezekiah, and how they saw God's dominion and how we see it apply to us? Did anyone else write anything down or think about it? I'm going to take that as a no. Melanie, did you?
I didn't write anything down, but yeah.
Did you have
Ken and I
ideas?
had lots of conversation before
Afterwards?
that.
Or
Well, no,
after? Or
mostly before. Yeah,
Okay.
we talked before.
Okay. Well, I guess I did.
Melanie gets previews of everything
Well, that's
ahead
true.
of time.
She kinda knows it's coming, so she wasn't surprised.
We had
Yeah.
conversations about it.
We had, yeah. Well, I didn't hear through first or second. I didn't hear your response
Okay.
until I actually went back and listened. It seems like Hezekiah, and maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, which could be a real possibility here, but he seems like to him God's power is almost in the cosmic Santa Claus. Like, I'm here, and when I need something, I'm blessed. And I mean, look what I have. And with Daniel, and they almost seem to have a lot of the same. You said that there was some royalty likely in their lineage. Do you think they grew up a lot differently? Because it seems like they got an extra set of values that Hezekiah was missing. Like, hey, we're grateful for things. We know where things come from. God is good. But it seems like they were both well-educated, smart. Like they would have known, like they would have been almost equals. Is that fair or is that unfair?
Well, Hezekiah was named as one of the good kings, so I don't know that it was like a lack of values necessarily. I think we just end up in places sometimes where we detour a little bit, maybe from what our values are.
Yeah, and Hezekiah, and I think that's one of the things I was hoping that I didn't talk about in the sermon, but I was hoping people would think a little bit about, because Hezekiah is one of the good kings in the Bible. And as I think I mentioned in the Bible, arguably after David, he's considered one of the best kings of Judah. And he does a lot of really great things. And so in my sermon, I kind of pick on him a little bit. I think the Bible picks on him a little bit. With that said, one of the things that I hope that people find hopeful about this story is that in spite of Hezekiah having some flaws, God's there with him. God doesn't throw him to the side. I mean, like, oh, look at you.
Yeah.
You're a selfish guy. You're only thinking about yourself because you're like, oh, well, at least it's not happening in my lifetime that this place is going to be overthrown. I think it's important for us to think about that people can be flawed and God can still be using them. God can still be, they can, be a part of God's plan of salvation. People are not perfect, and that's important because I think that sometimes we can get really discouraged when we make mistakes and we think, oh, well, God, how can God love me? How can he care about me? And just look at Hezekiah. Hezekiah does some things that aren't smart. He does some things that maybe could be argued are wrong, and yet God still gives him his favor, still loves him, does a lot of good things for him, and is there with him. And so I think that's an important part of this story. And I wanted to use Hezekiah in this sermon because I think we don't often think about what led up to Daniel and his friends being taken into captivity. We often take Bible stories and we just kind of take them right where they're at, and we don't think about all the background behind them and the things that led up to it. And obviously, there's actually a lot more that led up to this than just Hezekiah. There's several bad kings that come after Hezekiah. In fact, probably Daniel and his friends were maybe grandsons, great-grandsons, great-great-grandsons of Hezekiah.
Really?
Yeah. There's a likelihood of that because they were royal. They were part of the upper class of Judah when it was overthrown by the Babylonians. And so in Isaiah 39, Isaiah says that some of your sons will be taken into captivity. And the way that phrase is used in the Bible community, it basically means your progeny, somebody who comes after you. And so it's very likely that they were directly related to Hezekiah in some way. And so, here you have a number of young men that are taken to captivity. 4 of them are named. The 4 heroes of the book of Daniel are named, but there were probably a lot of other young men that went as well. And they're the result of Hezekiah's, well, it's not going to happen in my generation. Well, it happened in their generation.
Yeah.
And how do they handle getting that punch in the face? And how does Hezekiah handle getting punched in the face when, Isaiah comes and says, you're going to die? What I was hoping that people would do is start making the compare and contrast between the way both of these people react to bad things happening in their life. One kind of curls up and gives up in a way. I mean, I guess he's praying, but you kind of get the feeling that Hezekiah has just kind of given up. He just kind of curls up in a corner and starts crying about it. Yeah. Which, again, I don't want to judge, because if I got a terminal diagnosis today or tomorrow, I think I would do something probably similar. When you're at a certain point in life, you're like, I'm not quite ready yet. I've got more things to do. And so I can totally understand that. At the same time, Daniel literally has everything ripped out of his life, everything. And somehow maybe he doesn't have the luxury of laying down and crying about it. Although I wouldn't be surprised at all, over 4 months of traveling, and there was some tears and shed and some stuff going on there. But Daniel actually decides to stick with God, even when I think it would have been possible for Daniel to make the argument, and those around him, that God hadn't stuck by him.
Yeah.
And so I just think they're 2 very fascinating characters, both good. Hezekiah's a good character. Daniel's a good character. And they both handle it differently. And I do think that the way Daniel handles it is superior.
But I think what I just heard you say, and this was one of the things that kind of was going around in my head, was because initially you think to yourself, oh, come on, Hezekiah, you're going to throw this fit. And then Isaiah comes back and says, no, you're going to live another 15 years. But then with Daniel, you don't get that part of the story, but maybe that part of the story is there. Because when I stopped to think about it, I was like, there's no way, like walking 800 miles in sandals in the burning sand and all the terrain they had to traverse to get there, that there's not at one point you're like, I don't know, I think tonight I'm going to curse God while I'm sitting on this, thirsty, feet are in bad shape, I'm in bad shape, and we know probably, we're only guessing maybe what's going to happen to us when we get to wherever we're going, that maybe the same or worse story could have been written about Daniel?
Yeah. Well, I think that based on the evidence, Daniel and his friends were probably pretty well taken care of on that trip, because they were what high value people to the court. The goal of the Babylonians was to transform them into Babylonians, to take them out of their culture and their place, take the wisdom of Judah incorporated into Babylonian wisdom, but to turn these people into Babylonians. That was their goal. And so they probably were very well treated on that trip. I don't think it was like a death march for them. I think it was more of, they may even have had mules to ride or something like that. There's a lot of different possibilities. It doesn't change the fact, though, that traveling 800 miles on a donkey or by foot is not going to be the most comfortable thing to do. And I didn't spend a lot of time on this in the sermon because we have kids in the audience, but the Isaiah 39 heavily doesn't imply, it says your sons will be taken into captivity in Babylon and they will be eunuchs. And so there's the very strong implication that and scholars debate this. It goes back and, I think there's a lot more evidence on the side that Daniel and his friends were eunuchs than that they weren't. But there are those who say that, they weren't really eunuchs.
I think it's pretty likely.
But it seems incredibly likely that they were.
Why does it seem likely? I mean, wouldn't you want the smart people that you're taking their culture and you're, expanding yours and you're going to give them an important place, like they would have offspring? No?
Not in a court system. Inside of, in that time, of that place, inside of the royal court, anybody who is going to be in the intimate chambers of the king, particularly if they're going to be around the queen, they were going to. They did not want there to be any chance that the king's bloodline was tainted by anybody else. And so a lot of the courtiers inside the Babylonian court and other courts in that time period were made eunuchs. In fact, most modern translations don't put it this way, but Ashpenaz that's mentioned in Daniel 1 is in the older translations, he was called the chief of the eunuchs. And you could, when you take the original language, you can actually translate it that way, or you can translate it as the head of the court. But the point is that there's a lot of evidence pointing towards Daniel and his friends being eunuchs. We never see any children mentioned. We don't see wives mentioned. And then you go back to Isaiah 39, where Isaiah says, your sons will be eunuchs in the court of Babylon. There's a lot of evidence on the side of that being the case for Daniel. And so when we say that literally everything was taken from him, I mean literally everything. And for a Jewish person, this is a big deal. Genealogies are a big deal. And
that was eternal life, basically, for generations continued.
Basic, the promise to David was that somebody will from your line will always sit on the throne. So you may die, but you don't really die as long as there's somebody coming after you. And for Daniel, if he was a eunuch, it stopped with him. That was it.
Yeah.
There was not going to be grandchildren, great-grandchildren to say his name later on, to remember him. Outside of the Bible, there's a saying that there's I think, was it 2 times that you die? The first time you die is when you physically die, and the second time you die is the last time somebody ever says your name. After you've died, when your memory literally dies out from history.
For a long time.
Huh?
I'm going to live a long time on that second.
Because people will be saying your name for a long time because of the podcast.
Make sure you're memorable.
He left that one here too. Come on, man. Come on. No,
but for Daniel, and Daniel is, in that case, Daniel really does live on because he's not only are we talking about him today. Christ actually mentions he's one of Christ mentions Jonah the prophet, and he mentions Daniel the prophet. Quotes Isaiah pretty extensively, but he's kind of one of the Gospels mentioned Daniel very specifically in Christ's words. And so truly Daniel lived on in memory, even if he didn't have children to carry on his genes and who he, and that part of things. But for him, going to captivity, he couldn't have known all that. For him, it was, you're going, I've lived in places that weren't home, and I've lived in New Zealand for a year. In New Zealand, that's the best of assignments you can possibly get outside of the United States. It's pretty cush. And yet, I can just tell you how much I miss the United States. I miss the food that I'm used to. In New Zealand, the ketchup tastes different than ketchup in the United States. I know that sounds really trivial, but it it got to me after a while. It's like you're trying, it's just not the same. They're speaking English, but they use different words for different things. And, just looking at Lucas, Lucas, you grew up in Brazil, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you're enjoying the United States, but they're just things that people don't understand, the things that you miss, things that you're like food. And when you get together with other Brazilians here in the United States, you feel like there's a little bit of home and you're like, okay. But for Daniel, just think about that. I mean, he's going to a foreign country. He's learning a new language. He's learning new customs. He's learning new ways of doing things. He may be a eunuch. There is so much. His entire life is just absolutely obliterated from whatever it was that he was dreaming it was going to be back when he was in Judah.
Yeah, it's like taking a donkey ride from Orlando to Kentucky. I mean,
Washington D.C. Yeah,
think about a different country where they don't speak the language.
Oh my goodness!
I am really
That's
sorry
Randy
for those of you in Kentucky.
We
apologize for Randy, and
he's just trying to make a name for himself that will last forever.
That's right.
He'll not be paid for this episode of the podcast, just so that we can.
No, yeah, but I think it's even true when you move from even your home state or your home city. There's just things that you grow up with that are comfortable, that are just the order is there. It's where it needs to be. It's where you feel comfortable. It's where the friends that know everything about you are, and all those things. And that there's no doubt that there had to be. Even if it was a well taken care of journey, I think that was just a really trying journey as well.
Absolutely.
All right, I want to start getting to questions and comments because we have a ton of them, and like good Adventists, a lot of this is based on the food.
The food.
Yeah, we were
get down to that food potluck time.
Exactly, and I think that there was. I think even if you go back to the My Bible Friend stories about, the what did they call it? The pulse and water, I think it was in the book. And, and the artist did a great rendition of all the boys that were eating the king's food. Yep. And then here's the four that shine above everybody else. And so, if you grew up Adventist, that you'll understand that reference. And if not, you can. They're online.
I'll just say, you're right with Adventists. And I will also say, any other time I've heard from any other denomination about Daniel, you tend to focus on the food. That the focus is kind of right. Yeah. It's that becomes kind of the thing. I think that there are people who are surprised that there are other I think there are Adventists, Seventh-day Adventists. They're surprised that there are other denominations that do Daniel fasts as well.
Yeah,
it's not just a Seventh-day Adventist thing.
Well, and I think Ben kind of led the charge early with food is cultural. We've already talked about that a little bit. Perhaps that's one of the only pieces they could retain of their home, even for just like the most simple, hey, you're going to ask for what, again, maybe bring a little bit of that comfort food back in there. Analysis 2 said Daniel and friends understood that chaos around them was out of their control, but what was internal was theirs to control. Hence, diet was their stand, which would also help them withstand the external assaults.
So I think that there's a good point to that. I would suggest that it's also that what they decided they were going to learn was within their control. They didn't have to. They could have slammed the book shut and said, "Hey, I'm not going to study this book. I'm not going to look through this scroll. I'm not going to do this." They could have decided not to respond to the Babylonian names that were, nods to the Babylonian gods. They just, nope, I'm not going to. You can call me whatever you want, but I'm not going to respond to it. And there's no evidence that they didn't do that. And so I think. I think that's one of the things that Melanie pushed me on a little bit this week as I was kind of processing through things because I kind of went to this is definitely within their control, but there were other things that they went ahead and went along with that really were within their control as well.
It sounds like the names were a big deal.
Names were a huge deal.
I guess, it's not surprising, but I'm not sure I get the connection. I mean, you said they were names of...
So I always like to use the metaphor that names in the Old Testament, really in the Bible in general, are a lot like social security numbers. You don't really share your social security number with people unless there's a really good reason to. And if your social security number is changed, that's a pretty big deal. And why do I say social security number? Because your social security number will pull up a lot of information about you. And in the Bible, names did the same thing. It's the reason why whenever there's a big event, God will sometimes change people's names. Like Abram went to Abraham, Jacob went to Israel. And so God changes names at pivotal points in people's lives to make a reference that there's some substantial change, or that there's some substantial change that God's wanting to make. And so, in fact, in Old Testament times, people would sometimes not share their name with somebody until they became friends or closer to them, because, and that's why, think about it, when Jacob's wrestling with the angel in Genesis, and he says, Jacob says, I won't let you go until you tell me your name. And the angel says, yeah, I'm not going to tell you that. And it's because names were that big of a deal. It wasn't that like, I'm not going to tell you my name is Ken because I don't want you. It is because there's so much information in a name. And so when the Babylonians changed Daniel's name and his friend's name, it's not just it's not, well, your name is really hard for us to pronounce. Sometimes if you go to another country, if you have a name that's like just unusual for that country, you'll try to find something that's like it in the country that you're moving to. And then it wasn't like that. For the Babylonians, the Babylonians were specifically saying, look, you're Babylonian now. Here's who you are now.
And we don't do this halfway kind of stuff.
That was your God then. This is going to be your new. And the Babylonians didn't care that you had multiple gods. That was no problem for them. You want to worship your God, that's fine. Everybody worships their own God. But just remember, the most important God is Marduk for the Babylonians. And so this is the one, and because you're a prominent person in our court, you're going to have a name that gives a nod to our gods and that point out that you're under their authority now. So names are a huge deal.
Yeah, so just a little tidbit. If any name in the Bible that ends in EL is likely translated something about God, because that's a word for God in the Old Testament.
EL?
EL
Is a complete word?
Israel, Daniel, Mishael. All of those words mean something. I think Mishael means something like who is like God or something like that.
Wow.
But
Okay. All right.
yeah, and here's the interesting thing though, to me, like they changed Daniel's name to Belteshazzar, and yet throughout the entire book, he's referred to as Daniel, even by the kings, and even by the queen mother at the end of the book, or at the end of the narrative portion of the book. They refer to him as Daniel. So
Don't they refer to him only as Belshazzar when they ask him, when the king is drunk and asks him to come and read what's on the wall? Doesn't he refer to him at that point?
The queen mother says, "Go find Daniel."
Go get Daniel.
Yeah.
Okay.
And why do they keep calling him Daniel?
That's a good question. That's what I don't know. I think it's interesting.
It is interesting. Maybe Daniel did make more of a stand on that, but let me read you the name, because it's actually worth your time. The name Daniel in Hebrew means God is my judge. The name Hananiah means Yah is gracious, Yah being a name for God. Mishael means who is what God is. Who is what God is. And Azariah means Yahweh has helped. And so then their names are changed. So Daniel's name is changed from God is my judge to Belteshazzar, which means Bel is my judge, which is so his name is really it's taken, and instead of God, Yahweh being my judge, it's now the Babylonian chief god.
The Babylonians knew.
Yeah, there was definitely some tongue-in-cheek stuff going on there. It's like
that's crazy.
And then Shadrach, the Chaldean name for Shadrach means under Aku's command, and then Meshach means who is what Aku is. So remember, the other one is who is what God is. And then Abednego means servant of Nego, which is another Babylonian god. So anyway, so they're changed from these beautiful names giving credit to Yahweh, Israel's God, the God that we worship today, that we and so they changed them to these Babylonian gods, and it's a big deal. It's not a small thing.
So, what's the difference if we're looking at the power of those names, and it's like, okay, you're under the power of, and this, they're all referring back to pagan gods, versus the stand they take with, we're not bowing down. I'm probably going to get to that later.
Yeah, that's not this week, but the following week.
But the following week. But that seems like, because I can just hear someone being like, well, why would you answer to that if you, because obviously the four knew what the names meant too. It wasn't like they were, right? They were smart enough to know that. Yeah. Obviously.
Yeah.
And
sure.
So that seems like, well, Randy means, Satan leads me. And I'll be like, well, wow. Great. Thank you. I think I'll keep that. That sounds, warm and inviting and refreshing. You know what I'm saying? It seems like, why would they keep something that would seemingly be as absurd as that?
And I was hoping that was something that people would wrestle with, because that's one of that was one of the questions that I asked this week. Why did they accept what they accepted? Why they reject what they rejected?
Yeah, that one I just didn't. Yeah, but I didn't realize how what you guys just talked about made it seem more.
No, I was wondering, because if names was such a big deal, like why did God in a certain way allowed them to change their names, but not the food? Like I keep going back to that, and
yeah, good stuff. So we've definitely.
Well, let's continue with food. Neil said, food and wine is greatly reliant on harvest seasons. Perhaps Daniel and friends drew from Deuteronomy 8, where man doesn't live on bread alone, but from every word that comes from the mouth of God. Okay. Trifina, I don't think they viewed God's dominion differently, but like us, they look at things based on age and stage of spiritual development and life experiences. Similarly, we accept and reject things based on experiences. So I think everyone is trying to kind of wrap their minds around the questions that you asked, but maybe there's not any great answers for that one.
I think that this is one of the joys of reading the Bible, is looking at it critically rather than looking at it and just glossing over it. Because if you just go into it and say, well, and take kind of the children's book approach to it, you never get to some of the deeper, more really worthy conversations, and that really, I think, will have an impact on how you live your own life and think through what you choose to do and what you choose not to do, and where you choose to take a stand, and where you say, no, I'm not going to take a stand on this, but I am going to take a stand on this. And so I think really having deep thoughts and thinking through this is really a worthwhile thing.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated by it. When I look at it, are you wanting me to get down to what my thoughts were on that, or are you wanting to wait for a while on that? Or
well, I was gonna hopefully wrap up with that.
Okay.
As we get through, because we still have another page of questions to go yet.
All right.
But Asking said, these are definitely important things to consider as we currently consider what makes a good leader: humility, sacrifice, care for the future of our world. And I was like, man, someone was paying attention about what we have upcoming. And Gabby, I always too have a plan before life metaphorically punches me in the face, but really I believe it's God showing me that my plan is not his plan. What a great reminder. The TTC said the body is a temple of God, and in the area of food is one of the hardest ways to demonstrate discipline. In doing that, they showed their commitment and ability to be disciplined and committed to God. So I think people were, again, the food theme kind of continues, but Catherine said Daniel and his friends had their physical temple taken away, but they knew no one could take their spiritual temple away, their bodies. So they chose to honor God by treating their bodies as temples of God and only accept the best and healthiest food. That's kind of a cool, in a way, is your body as a temple, maybe offsetting that name thing a little bit, like, hey, this is the part I can really control. Because maybe Daniel didn't take his name quite so laying down, as it were, or just possibly. So maybe, but they didn't really have doesn't seem like they would have had much of a choice but to be called
Right.
who you are. And what
we don't have any record of any kind of showdown having to do with this
for
name.
this. Yeah. Anon said, if your name is taken away, you still know in your heart that you're a child of God, but your body being a temple is a concept so concrete that ingesting food and drink that is foreign can quite literally ruin your temple. Melinda said, perhaps by choosing just one thing to reject, they could put the focus that God is dominion and would show how he would bless them. And the diet they continued to follow was God's original diet in the Garden of Eden when we were closest to him. They chose to remain close. Okay. And then the last one that I wanted to get to, Aaron said, I wonder if part of the reason God gives us a new name mentioned in Revelation has to do with what Ken was talking about, how names can affect us psychologically and our identity. Besides our birth name, we have probably internalized some names or beliefs about ourselves and our lives. And so God giving us a new name is to help counter and heal that. So there was, between names and the food and the possible reasons, do we know how old they were?
When they went into captivity?
When they were?
Young.
Probably somewhere between 15 and 19.
15 and 19. And do we know how long Daniel lived?
60. Well, he served 3 different empires for a total of 66 years.
66 years.
So at the very end of Daniel, he is in his 80s. And it is a fascinating thing that Daniel outlives 4 different he outlives 3 different empires. He outlives Judah, he outlives Babylon, he outlives the Medes, and then his final one is the Persians.
Yeah. Wow. That's crazy.
Sees the rise and fall of 3 different kingdoms and lives through part of a 4th.
For that long of a period, that seems like it's pretty calm, other than those, like, until you run into the people that are the jealous and
I think Daniel is just a good thought study for people who think that that a country has to be a Judeo-Christian values country in order for them to support it and to work for its good, because Daniel works for 3 very, very secular governments, people with not only different, very hugely different values, different gods, and yet Daniel works for the good of all 3 of those kingdoms. And you really don't hear Daniel spending a lot of time railing against the kingdom itself. He just goes about living his life for God the way that he believes it needs to be done, and lets his and that's one of the lessons when you see in this book is that Daniel lets his life do the talking rather than trying to legislate for everybody else how they need to be.
That's pretty good. And then finally, Nashville Tim said, if anyone wants to read a great book on the book of Daniel, read Daniel by Desmond Ford.
Okay.
I didn't know Desmond Ford was an author.
You didn't?
I didn't.
Yeah, he's pretty prolific.
Oh, Desmond Ford. Who am I thinking of? Oh, I was thinking, never mind.
I have a copy. You can borrow it.
Oh, all right. Is it good? Do you concur with Mr. Nashville Tim?
I always like to read different viewpoints.
Okay.
I'll put it that way. Yes.
Different. Oh, now I'm intrigued. So now we have to. Okay, all right. I'll read it. That'll be my second book, and so that'll be. I'll make a full report.
I haven't read that, so maybe I'll have to take you up on that, Nashville Tim.
Yeah, I'll throw just in case you want to take a peek. I'll throw a link in the show notes, and that'll make it easy if you want to find a copy as well. So Ken, give us your. You did a little bit for response time, but what does Ken say the difference is between the way Daniel and his friends and Hezekiah went about showing or portraying the dominion or attacking that in their lives?
So like I said in the church service, for me, it's what you think God's dominion in your life is for. What you think the purpose of following God, giving God dominion in your life, why you think you do that. I think that Hezekiah viewed it as a means to getting things. For Hezekiah, it was, if I do what God asked me to do, then I'll get all these different blessings, which there's a good reason for him to think that. The Bible spells that out. And if you do this, you'll get this. If you don't do this, the blessings and the curses at the end of Deuteronomy. So there's a good reason for him to think that. You have to think, though, that when Daniel had everything taken from him, he had to really rethink that a little bit and rethink what his take on was going to be on that. And for me, when I look at Daniel lives this just absolute life of service. He is, while I wouldn't describe him as being loudly evangelistic, he is very evangelistic in the way he lives his life. He's very consistent with how he behaves and what he does and how he acts. And his life is this testimony to who he believes God to be. And it appears to me that Daniel views God's dominion in his life as a means to be a blessing to others. That when bad things happen to Daniel says, okay, God, so what do you want to do with that? How do you want to use that to be a blessing? Because Daniel's life is a testimony to multiple kings about who God is. God uses him, as we'll discover a little bit later on. There's some evidence that Nebuchadnezzar, in the end, believes in Yahweh. That he believes that Yahweh's the supreme God, and that Daniel may have converted in some ways. And there's evidence that the royal court was very familiar, because the Queen Mother says about Daniel that this is a man in whom the Spirit of the living God lives. And so people become very familiar with who God is, who Yahweh is, because of the way that Daniel goes about living his life, even though I think we could all argue that Daniel had every reason to be very disappointed in what God had done originally. Now, he goes on, and God definitely seems to bless Daniel, right? He becomes like the prime minister of the country. So there's a lot of good things happening in Daniel's life later on. I would just also say, though, there's no place like home. And even though he's a very powerful man in a very powerful country, I don't think it would have felt the same as being having children, family in his own country.
And he never goes back, correct?
Never goes back.
That's right.
At least it's not recorded. Yeah.
Okay.
He would have been very, very old if that was at that point when.
Just living his life that way has to stick out like a sore thumb comparatively to those around him, right?
Yeah.
For them to take notice. But I love what you just said, that like living that way, and even the Queen Mother and other people in very high places just look at his life and know something is different and realize who the living God is. And it really makes a case, and I like what it means to me, that less convincing, more living. That's a pretty powerful statement about how you live your life if people find that as like what they understand or what they know about you. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. I think Daniel's just such an amazing biblical character when you look at him. And to me, if you were to take that one lesson out of the book of Daniel, it would probably transform your life, because if you view that God in your life is so that you can have a better life, so bad things don't happen to you, when you get punched in the face, when that plan doesn't work out, it's devastating. If, on the other hand, you view God as the purpose of God is his dominion in your life is to allow you to be a blessing to the rest of the world, and that sometimes your suffering can be a blessing to others, that changes the way that you get punched in the face and how you react to it. Because when you get punched in the face, you're not expecting it. And I think that was the thing. I think Hezekiah gets punched in the face. He's not expecting it.
Not at all.
Well, that's not a part of the plan. Daniel gets punched in the face, and whether he was expecting it or not, he was able to rework his worldview to the point where he was like, well, maybe that's just part of the plan. And I will go ahead and submit to God's dominion, even when I don't like it, and when it's not what's best for me. if it's best for God's plan. And that's really what we're going to see throughout the rest of this story, is that Daniel wants to be faithful to God no matter what, and his friends the same. So, and that kind of takes us to the question about the food versus the other things. And there's a lot going in there, and I think you can look at it a lot of different ways. One of the things that we talked about was that there are a lot of different ways that the Babylonians were trying to change them into Babylonians. And when you look at the food and the wine that's being offered to them, the food most likely was not kosher food, at least the food portion of it, although that food would have also included bread and other things that would have been okay for a good Jewish person to partake of. The other part that of that is that when they refused the king's food and wine, and that word for wine in the Hebrew is actually used in several other places where there are other good kings of Israel that are partaking of wine. It's important to remember that the Jewish people were restricted from getting drunk. That was not okay. But they did, just look through the Bible and look at the verses on wine, and this is not me advocating for drinking alcohol, but what it is to say is that the wine part of that would not have been considered not kosher. In fact, later on in the book of Daniel talks about in another place, I believe it was in Daniel 10, verses 2 and 3, Daniel records, "When this vision came to me, I, Daniel, had been in mourning for 3 whole weeks. All that time I'd eaten no rich food," which would have been kind of similar back to Daniel 1. "No meat or wine crossed my lips, and I used no fragrant lotions until those 3 weeks had passed." So there's the implication there that after those 3 weeks had passed, then he did. And so this particular, in Daniel 1, what you see happening, I think, is Daniel taking a stand and making a point about something that the Babylonians would have been very clear that his God was blessing him. Because in their mind, if Daniel doesn't eat this food, he's going to get weak, he's going to, and instead, Daniel's God blesses him when he sticks with what they would have understood to be a very Jewish kosher diet, when he goes on a fast. And basically what Daniel's doing in Daniel 1 is going on a fast. He's fasting, and he's making the point that he needs God to do what only God can do. And it's very visible to the Babylonians. I also want to point out that Daniel's very respectful in the way he goes about doing this. He doesn't just go on a hunger strike. He doesn't go, "I'm not going to eat anything unless you give me this." He goes and he asks very respectfully that this happen. And it goes, gets denied the first time, goes to somebody else, asks for a 10-day trial. What can really happen in 10 days? Most medical professionals will tell you 10 days of diet's not going to do a lot, no matter what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure.
But in that case, it apparently it showed up really quickly, and they allow them to continue on. And so the idea, I think, is that Daniel is in a period of fasting here where he's trying to basically make the point, firstly, I'm not going to take food that's been dedicated to idols, and in so doing, let you know that I am worshiping your God. I'm not going to do that. That's a line for me. And then the other part is that he's maybe having this fast because he knows he's in a situation where it's going to be important for him to be at his best so that he can be the best learner, he can be the best scholar, so that he can shine, and that the credit will go to God. And that's what we're going to really see as we move into next week and we talk about Daniel chapter 2, how important it was for Daniel to be that connected with God, that filled with God's wisdom. And the court's going to recognize that there's something different about Daniel. Them. And so I think that when Daniel goes on this fast, I view it as a fast. I view it that he took on this to make a point. It was also very visible to the Babylonians about that something special was happening there, and it brought glory to God in a different way. I mean, think about it. If he had refused to, if he didn't answer to the names that he was called, he becomes that person in the court. They're like, "Oh my word, this guy. And so it seems to me that Daniel only does things that actually benefit the Babylonian Empire in the long run, and he's very careful not to alienate people. in what he does. He's very, very careful not to do things that would like bring alienation. And I'm not going to answer to this name, and I'm not going to learn this literature. I'm smart enough as is. He doesn't do those things that would have really alienated the Babylonians. Instead, he does something that when he does it, it actually benefits the Babylonians in the long run. And he gives them a test period to be able to say, I trust my God. He'll show you that this is, and so he takes that on. Still is able to retain it, and it's also a reminder to him of who he is really. That I can be called all these other things, but who I am is I'm a follower of God. That's who I am. I'm not all these other names that I'm being given. I'm not even the wisdom and literature. I'm learning that, but it's not who I am. And so he really retains that, and that's my takeaway when I look at it. And I think it's really important for us to think through, because Jesus says in Matthew 15, or maybe it's Matthew 15. Jesus says, "Hear and understand. It's not what enters the mouth that defiles the person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles the person." And so when I look at Daniel, it's not so much of what's going in that he's worried about; it's what's going to come out of him. And so that diet isn't some magical. If you eat vegetables and drink only water, that there's something magical about that. It is, in my opinion, the fast. It's the putting yourself in God's hands and saying, God, look, I am doing this to remind myself of who I belong to and who I am and what's important. Now, I do think that, that there are better dietary choices than others, right? Sure. And I think that the one he was on was a good one. And I think that we really do ourselves a disservice when we act like the food, like if you just eat vegetables and drink water, that's the magical thing that's going on here. The spiritual thing that's going on here is this spiritual fast that Daniel's on, and it's this having God's spirit in him and wanting that spirit in him. I think that's what's really important, and that's going to impact what's going to come out of him.
I like that. Rena said, trusting God means trusting him with the outcome and not with our expectations. We often don't trust he will come through, and that reveals our expectations. Daniel trusted God with the outcome. I love that. I thought that was a good way to wrap it up. And, a big shout out to Ken Bradley, our King Hezekiah.
Excellent job, Ken. Excellent job.
It. I didn't see that through the practice or anything during the week. And so the first time, again, was actually, I hadn't looked at that until this morning when I got up and I watched that, and I was like, well, he was a mayor once, right? So, I mean, he kind of understands the process, but
I feel like he was uniquely qualified.
Uniquely, he nailed it. And I was like, if he had come out in the the purple robes and a crown and with a true throne to sit on, I would have believed it. Been like, yep. Okay.
I believed it the way it was.
Yeah, I believed the way it was. So good job, Ken. That was awesome. So this week is week 2, and we're going to
be focusing in on Daniel 2.
Daniel 2.
Yeah, this is the Nebuchadnezzar's vision.
Oh, the vision.
His dream that he once interpreted for him, and then he tells the wise men of Babylon, I need to know what my dream means. And they go, cool, tell us about your dream. We'll tell you what it means. He's like, nope, I'm not going to. You tell me what it means, and then we'll go from there.
He pulled a Ken.
He pulled a Ken.
There we go. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's what always happens. I hate it when Ken calls us all in and asks us to tell him what he dreamed.
I know, right?
I do that about once a week.
So don't bother tuning in next week, because there'll be no questions. I'm sure this is something that everyone knows a lot about, and there won't be anything to think about or to do.
No.
Oh, no. I'm stirring the pot next week.
Oh, all right. So next week we are going to have a new guest host. She's going to steer the whole thing, and we're going to put the ladle in all the way to the bottom, make sure there's nothing left on the bottom. We're going to pull it all to the top and see what happens. Ooh, I'm excited now.
Yeah.
Well, you heard it here first, so don't miss it. Tell a friend, share an episode, make sure that they know that Melanie is on her way. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.